Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's great to see the theater filled again. I'm Michael Taylor. I'm the Chief Curator and Deputy Director for Art and Education here at VMFA. And I am introducing tonight Dr. Sylvain Cordier, who, as many of you know, is the Paul Mellon Curator and Department Head of the European Art Department. And he came to VMFA. He wasn't a stranger to us. He had been the curator of the Rodin exhibition and the Napoleon exhibition, so you knew what he was capable of before he came in November 2019. But the first task was reinstalling the Mellon collection. We didn't realize it would be delayed for a year with COVID, but it made it that much better. I think the galleries are absolutely stunning. If you haven't gone up and seen them, do go see them after this lecture. You will see the Mellon collection with fresh eyes and new insights. They're really great. And the Schlumberger galleries as well, which that collection wasn't given until later. So Paul Mellon's collection was only, this is kind of the first time they've been joined the way that Paul and Bunny envisioned it. It's just extraordinary. So Sylvain, please come to the stage and introduce our illustrious speaker. Enjoy tonight's talk.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce tonight a wonderful friend and an amazing scholar. I'm very, very happy that she has agreed to fly north to us and to be with us tonight for this Paul Mellon lecture. Dr. Nicole Myers is interim chief curator and the Barbara Thomas Lemmon senior curator at the Dallas Museum of Art. She completed her master's and doctorate degrees in art history at the IFA, the Institute of Fine Arts at the New York University, with a dissertation on Gustave Courbet's realist nudes. Nicole is a specialist of French painting, and she has published on wide-ranging topics from realism to symbolism, from Poussin, so from the 17th century, up to Van Gogh. She joined the Dallas Museum of Art in February 2016 to oversee their collection of European arts, and prior to Dallas, she held curatorial position at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, at the Met, at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, and at the St. Louis Art Museum. Since she's been in Dallas, she has curated or co-curated numerous exhibitions, including most recently the very critically acclaimed Cubism in Color, the Still Lifes of Rouen Gris, in 2021, which is an exhibition to which we were very happy to lend an artwork. She also co-curated Berthe Morisot, Woman Impressionist in 2018-2019, which was co-organized with the Musée National des Beaux-Arts du Québec in Quebec City in Canada, and with the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia and the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. At the same time when Berthe Morisot was presented in Dallas, Nikki curated also an exhibition entitled Women Artists in Europe from the Monarchy to Modernism, which was a show which highlighted Dallas's exceptional holdings of artworks by female artists. Her current exhibition, Van Gogh and the Olives Groves, just opened at the Dallas Museum of Art last month, and it brings the subject of her lecture tonight, to which I'm very, very much looking forward. The show will travel to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam in the spring of 2022, the Van Gogh Museum being the exhibition's co-organizer. And I just have to say that this year was my first opportunity as a VMFA's Paul Mellon curator to invite a reputed scholar to do us the honor of coming to visit and present a lecture on a subject related to the Mellon collection. And really, I have to say, it didn't take me a lot of time to understand that there would hardly be a better candidate than the wonderful Nikki, and who have had the pleasure to know since the time that she was at the Nelson Atkins and I was at the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts, and who is, I really believe, one of the greatest and most talented specialists of French art that we have here in the US. And I think, as Michael mentioned tonight, the stars aligned wonderfully, because of course it's my great pleasure to look at this Mellon lecture as the first one of the recently reopened Mellon gallery, but it's also a pleasure to relate Nikki's presence tonight to this extraordinary exhibition that she has worked on for so many years on Van Gogh's Olive Grove series, which is a theme that you will see from so many points of view is really absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much, Nikki, for being with us tonight, and we really look forward to listening to you.
Wow. Thank you so much, everyone, truly. It is great to be here. It is great to see you all in person. And of course, to those of you tuning in from home, I'm really glad that you chose to spend your evening with me and Vincent and the Olive Groves. I mean, it is just such an honor to be invited to deliver this prestigious Paul Mellon lecture. And I'm really glad, again, that it worked out for me to be here. So I just want to thank Sylvain for the invitation, truly. And when he called me, several months ago, I mean, really a long time, and he said, would you be interested in coming to give this lecture? It's going to be in November. And what do you think that you'd want to talk about? And it didn't take me long to think at all that I would love to tell you all about the fascinating story of Van Gogh and the Olive Groves. As you've heard, the exhibition just opened to the public there about 2 weeks ago, and we'll travel on to our partner, the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, this spring. So Dallas is the only place in North America to see this exhibition. So I'm looking at all your faces, and I'm going to hope to welcome you in Dallas. The show is up through the first week of February. Van Gogh and the Olive Groves takes as its subject the extraordinary series of paintings that Van Gogh dedicated to olive trees during his year-long stay at the asylum in Samhami, which is a small town in southern France in the region of Provence. Over the course of 6 months, he produced a striking series of 15 paintings that portray olive trees at different times of day and in different seasons, in a quest to unlock their quintessential features. Looking back on his production after he'd left Samhami and returned north in 1890, Van Gogh considered his Olive Grove series to be among his best work from his time in southern France, and not just from Samhami, but his entire 2-year stint in Provence. And this is a period that saw him produce some of his most famous and iconic paintings, works like, the sunflowers, the bedroom, the irises, the starry night. Maybe you've heard of some of these. Yet, in spite of the importance that Van Gogh gave to his Olive Grove series, these paintings surprisingly remain some of his least well-known works. There's never been a serious study, there's never been a serious publication, and there had never been an exhibition until now. Van Gogh and the Olive Groves is the very first exhibition to bring together this significant and ambitious series in Van Gogh's production. In addition to contextualizing this group of paintings within the artist's lifelong penchant for producing works in series or decorative ensembles, our exhibition debuts groundbreaking research from a multi-year, interdisciplinary, comparative study of all 15 paintings in the Olive Grove series. And we launched the project because I had some really basic art historical questions. I couldn't believe that not all of the 15 paintings were dated. The order in which they were made wasn't known. And the appearance of the colors in the paintings today don't necessarily match the descriptions that Van Gogh gave to them in his letters. So we had a lot of questions about what might have changed in terms of their appearance over time. And I'm showing you just a few pictures here of the research team. We brought together conservators and scientists, researchers, and the exhibition's co-curators together, again, over the course of 3 years, to conduct this study. So you're seeing some glimpses into the different kinds of research that were taking place on some of the different paintings in this series. But I'm not going to talk to you about that tonight. At the heart of the exhibition really is the deeply personal and often spiritual resonance that this motif held for Van Gogh, and this is what we're going to focus tonight's Mellon lecture on. Van Gogh moved to Samhami in May 1889 from nearby Arles, where he spent much of the previous 4 months in a hospital following a severe mental health crisis. Realizing that he should probably not live alone anymore, he admitted himself to a private asylum or a private clinic in Saint-Remy. Though relatively close to Arles, it's only about 15, 16 miles away, the landscape surrounding his new home was dramatically different. Arles is in a really fertile plain. It had lots of fruit orchards, for example, lots of vineyards. But Saint-Remy was something a bit different, as you can see from the photograph on the right there on your screen. It's nestled at the base of the Alpilles mountain range, and it's a rocky and rugged terrain. Not much thrived there, except for abundant olive trees, and there were groves everywhere. You can see them again in the photograph and in the advertisement, even for the asylum, and these immediately captivated him and captured his imagination. Van Gogh's choice to depict olive trees wasn't a given. It's actually a pretty unconventional subject, and one that is actually, I think, really challenging to paint. There's no one quintessential shape or color that denotes the olive tree. Sometimes they're tall, sometimes they're squat, sometimes they're straight, sometimes they're gnarled. Nor is it stereotypically picturesque. These are photos that I took. I went in June of 2015 to take a look and try to understand better what the appeal was. I find it amazing that the leaves are two tones, so they're constantly shifting color in the slightest bit of breeze, and there's millions of these on these trees. So they're kind of like shapeshifters in a way, really different than the kinds of things that maybe had attracted him before. For an artist that truly reveled in the changing colors of the landscape from season to season, the olive tree's appeal wasn't in its appearance, but rather it resided, I think, someplace else for the artist. Van Gogh instantly recognized its potential as an original subject. He marveled over the fact that it had never really been painted before, and he saw an opportunity to distinguish himself from other avant-garde artists who were working in and around Paris in the north of France. But in addition to its novelty, Van Gogh also sensed its great symbolic potential. He had seen them in Arles, and before leaving for Saint-Remy, he wrote to his younger brother, Theo, "If you could see the olive trees at this time of year, the silver foliage greening up against the blue, and the orange plowed soil, a thing of such delicacy, so refined. That's to say that the murmur of an olive grove has something very intimate, immensely old about it. It's too beautiful for me to dare to paint it or to be able to form an idea of it." But his attitude changed when he arrived in Saint-Remy. At the asylum, Van Gogh was given a bedroom to sleep in and another room that faced a courtyard to use as his studio. During his first month there, he was restricted from leaving the asylum's grounds. "But what a beautiful land, and what beautiful blue, and what a sun," he wrote to Theo. "And yet I've only seen the garden and what I can make out through the window." That view that you're seeing here on the screen in your incredible Mellon little sketch, and the finished painting that you see there on the right, that's today in Copenhagen, is a walled-in wheat field beyond which silvery green olive trees are set against the Alpilles' rolling foothills. And these paintings really announce the principal motifs that would dominate his production during his year-long stay in Saint-Remy. After a month, in June, he was finally given permission to leave its grounds, and he headed out in search of motifs that evoke both the season and the distinctive character of the region, and he started with that view. So he went straight down behind the asylum into the wheat field for the first time, capturing, again, a study and then a larger painting, really just moving from the get-go, stunningly beautiful works. And after that, he immediately headed into the olive groves. As he often did when approaching a new subject, and as you just saw with the images that were on the screen before, Van Gogh began by making smaller, naturalistic studies en plein air. So he would set his easel outdoors, in this case in the olive groves, again to seize the olive tree's quintessential form and color. He adopted the Impressionist short and flickering brushstrokes and high-keyed palette to capture the dazzling effects of the bright Provençal sun in the summertime. In his words, he wanted to capture the time of day when one sees the green beetles and the cicadas flying in the heat. In many ways, the Olive Grove series can be seen as a continuation of his work that he'd been doing in Arles, where he'd lived for a year before. He was there from February 1888 to May of 1889. That's the moment he moves to Saint-Remy. So I'm going to take a moment to step us back in time. We're going to take a closer look at what he'd been doing in Arles. I think it's really important context for the sort of comprehension of what he'll end up doing with the Olive Grove series. Throughout his career, Van Gogh chased his subjects from season to season, charting the passage of time through the rhythms of agrarian activities, from flowering to fruiting, or sowing and ripening to the harvest. In Arles, he'd been making a series of flowering fruit trees to represent the season of spring. And so you're seeing two of those examples here. So they were among the first thing he paints when he moves to Arles. He goes straight to these lush, beautiful flowering orchards. Then, with the transition of spring to summer, he shifted his focus to the wheat fields, capturing their ripening and harvest in a series of about 10 paintings, and I'm showing you two that we've included in our exhibition in Dallas. The depiction of wheat fields throughout the year, from their green sort of growth in springtime to their ripening and their harvest in the summertime to the sowing of wheat in the fall, this would become one of Van Gogh's favorite and most constant motifs throughout his career. It actually started before he moved to France, and he would continue to do this until his death in 1890. This lifelong practice of recording the seasons through the rhythms of agrarian life was largely inspired by the Barbizon painter Jean-François Millet, whose depictions of peasant labor as allegories of the passage of time, both nature's and humankind's, resonated powerfully with Van Gogh, particularly those that allude to Christian doctrine, such as the sower that I'm showing you here on the screen. Van Gogh painted many versions of the sower, but this one he painted in November of 1888, so again, we're still in Arles, but he painted it during the period in which his friend Paul Gauguin, the painter, was staying with him. And it reflects the new style that Gauguin would call synthetism that was developed by Gauguin and their mutual friend Émile Bernard, really right around this time in 1888. Synthetism was a reaction against Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism, or Pointillism, as it really wanted to shift the emphasis from the objective recording of the real world, the natural world, to the expression of the artist's subjective thoughts and feelings when standing in nature before these subjects. So it emphasized the synthesis of observations from nature with the artist's memory and imagination, and it brought with it a greatly simplified style that exaggerated color, line, and form to evoke symbolic meanings or the artist's feelings about the subject that's being depicted. For Van Gogh, the subject of the sower carried really sort of deeply meaningful and religious significance for him on a deeply personal level. Sowing and reaping had long been seen as allegories for the cycle of life, of birth, growth, and death. Van Gogh associated the figure of the sower and the reaper with God, who both gave and took life. And though he was no longer a practicing Christian, he saw the presence of the divine in nature's endless cycle of renewal through the seasons. The sun setting behind his version of the sower appears like a halo, giving a saintly quality to this otherwise humble figure drawn from contemporary life. Van Gogh called such painting spiritually symbolic, if you will, but he called it consolatory painting, as it provided solace in spiritual renewal for a society weary from the stresses of modern living. And Van Gogh saw himself as a sower of sorts, sowing the seeds of modern art by depicting contemporary subjects in a modern style that connected the past with the present and often evoke deeper meaning about the world around us. So you're seeing him experiment here with this synthetist style. and actually I'll go back for a second, you see that in the sort of pure colors, for example, the kind of green sky. He gave a lot of power to color in expressing some of these different feelings in his paintings. And it was Gauguin who encouraged him to turn his back to nature and to paint this version of the sower, really relying on his imagination and his memory. So that was a stretch for Van Gogh, who was an artist who always believed in working directly in front of things you could see, but really experimenting with this new style. Van Gogh's ideas on what he called consolatory painting had crystallized in the summer of 1888 through a series of letters that he'd exchanged with Bernard on the subject of religious art, which was emerging as a prominent ideology within the synthetist circles centered around Bernard and Gauguin, who were working in Brittany, in the northwest of France. Van Gogh's first encounter with olive trees was actually during his time in Arles. There weren't a lot of them, but they were there in the countryside. And in fact, they had inspired him to think of religious paintings by Eugène Delacroix, the Romantic painter. And this is an artist who profoundly influenced his work with paintings that you're seeing here on the screen, paintings like Christ in the Garden of Olives and Christ Asleep During the Tempest. Van Gogh greatly admired Delacroix's depiction of the calming comfort of faith in the face of despair, which you can see in both of these depictions. For Van Gogh, Delacroix's painting spoke, quote, a symbolic language through color itself. Delacroix's paintings undoubtedly inspired Van Gogh to create not one, but two paintings depicting Christ in the Garden of Olives. This was during his time in Arles. Like Delacroix, whose example of this particular scene you're seeing there on the left, Van Gogh chose to depict the moment where the sorrowful Christ, alone in the Garden of Olives, and praying for the strength to accept his fate, was sent a consoling angel from God. And like Delacroix, Van Gogh relied on color to express feelings of consolation, which he felt was the most that anyone could hope to give or to receive in this life. But despite the fact that Van Gogh wrote in his letters that he'd gotten the color right in these two different sketches that he started of this biblical scene, we only know about them from his letters. He wrote to Bernard telling him about them, and also to his brother Theo. He blames the lack of models to pose for the figures of Christ and the angel for the reason why the paintings weren't successful and why he destroyed both of them. So we know that they exist, and he went into great detail explaining their color schemes. One was a daytime scene, one was a nighttime scene. But again, the fact that he just couldn't see these things in front of him in nature made him abandon the scene altogether. So he would eventually turn his back on that subject, explaining that while he took artistic license by simplifying or exaggerating color and form, he didn't, in his words, invent the whole of the painting. On the contrary, I find it ready-made, but to be untangled in the real world. Nevertheless, both religion and imagination played a prominent role in the discussions surrounding synthetism. And in his correspondence with Bernard, and then later with Gauguin, who came to join Van Gogh, moved in with him in Arles towards the end of October 1888. And as I mentioned, the Sower was made during that time, and it shows him really trying to experiment with that style and find different ways to bring in that spiritual meaning rather than depicting a religious figure. Van Gogh really struggled with this idea, though, of using imagination, of invention, in his words, abstraction. And he ended up having a lot of heated debates with Gauguin, who believed very firmly that was really the direction that art needed to go in. And in fact, their heated arguments about subjects like this contributed to Van Gogh's complete mental breakdown in late December, again around Christmas, which I think most of us know today, unfortunately, by the infamous ear incident. That was followed by a prolonged stay in the hospital that spring. Van Gogh had actually intended to return to the flowering fruit orchards. He'd even said this when summer came around and the trees lost their blooms. He wrote to Theo saying, I'm going to go back and I'm going to keep building upon this series. And he'd wanted to do that, but he found, unfortunately, that he was in and out of the hospital in Arles really throughout the spring. So we're now in early 1889. But he did manage, when he wasn't in the hospital and he was well, I think that's an important detail to remember, that when Van Gogh was ill, he could not work, he could not paint, he could not write letters. It was only when he was well, when he was lucid, that he could produce artwork. So in and out of these bouts, in and out of the hospital, he does manage to go back, and he paints a few of these flowering orchards, and you're seeing one of them here on the screen. These were among the last thing he paints before he goes to Saint-Remy. So by the time he gets to Saint-Remy, he's missed springtime. He missed the opportunity, right? There weren't flowering fruit orchards, sadly, in Saint-Remy, and it wouldn't have mattered. By the time he was able to leave the grounds of the asylum, it was June. So he was in search of new motifs. What was going to represent summer for him when in fact there weren't wheat fields really to be painted beyond the walls of the asylum? So this is this incredible background and context, if you will, for his exploration of the olive groves in June of 1899, again, just a month after his arrival in Saint-Remy. So as we've seen, the first two paintings in the series capture the blazing heat of the midday sun of the olive groves in a very impressionistic style. So you see those bright colors, the sort of short, sort of staccato brushwork, if you will, a lot of movement. I'm showing them in the order that we believe them to have been painted. So one is a small plein air sketch, painted all in one go, outdoors, we believe, there on the left in the collection of the National Galleries of Scotland. And then the second one, right out of the gate, is a large-scale, incredibly impressive and complex composition that you're seeing there on the right, painting in the collection of the Nelson Atkins Museum. One could say it launched this entire exhibition and my own fascination with the subject, as it's truly a stunning painting. You see these incredible undulating patterns of color and line that guide our eyes through the sun-dappled grove. He uses such a variety of brushwork and of colors, it creates an almost dizzying sensation of light and wind as it's flickering through the foliage. Satisfied with his initial attempt to grasp, again, really just the basic look and feel of his subject, Van Gogh next turned his attention to experimenting with a more accentuated style in order to express the deeper meaning that it held for him. "At last I have a landscape with olive trees," he wrote to his brother Theo around June 18th. "And also a new study of a starry sky. Although I haven't seen the latest canvases either by Gauguin or by Bernard, I'm fairly sure that these two studies I speak of are comparable in sentiment. When you've seen these two studies for a while, I'll perhaps be able to give you, better than in words, an idea of the things Gauguin, Bernard, and I sometimes chatted about and that preoccupied us. The two studies in question are what I'm showing you here, the olive trees and the Starry Night, a kind of pendant executed in the new synthetist aesthetic developed by Gauguin and Bernard. Rather than simply capturing objective appearance, Van Gogh exaggerated color, form, and line to express the spiritually resonant meaning that he associated with the olive groves. And I also am just going to point out, I bet you didn't know that the Starry Night has tons of olive trees. Look for them. They are there. So Van Gogh started, as he typically did, observing nature and making studies outdoors, like this one that you're seeing here. And it's a rare sketch of the subject. It's a little bit damaged, so you're seeing a torn corner there on the right. We were really excited to be able to present this in our exhibition in Dallas that shows very much that he's sort of figuring this out, painting trees, and you're seeing on the right, by the damage in the drawing, what's the beginning of Alpine mountains. But now we believe that Van Gogh painted his olive tree painting largely, if not entirely, in the room he used as a studio, combining his observation that you saw, sketches like the ones you saw, with memory and imagination, just as he's done with the Starry Night, a painting that was always believed to have been drawn using imagination and based again on things he had seen around in Saint-Remy. The extent to which Van Gogh exaggerated the forms and proportions are evident when you compare the mountain range, this very specific, identifiable formation in the Alpine, when you compare it to what it looks like today. So again, you're seeing my photograph because the received knowledge was that, oh, he paints en plein air, everything's painted outdoors just about from beginning to end, and so is this, and yeah, he exaggerates the forms a little bit, but that's it. He was standing in front of the motif, and I just thought, that just makes no sense. And I went and I stood in the spot, and you really get a sense, just to point out even the distance between them. This is a formation that translates to the rock with two holes, and Le Mont Gaussier. This is Le Mont Gaussier. This is the rock with two holes. So, I mean, you really had to be exaggerating quite a bit. And instead, what we now think and know is that he was turning his back on nature, working in his studio, and using his imagination. As Vincent explained to Theo, the aim of both the olive trees and the Starry Night was to console through the depiction of a more serene and pure nature, rather than through the depiction of traditional religious scenes, as Delacroix had done. The consolation for Van Gogh stemmed from the olive tree's multivalent meaning. Adapted to survive in poor conditions and perpetually renewing itself from its roots, the olive tree was the tree of life in the ancient Mediterranean world, symbolizing peace and abundance, strength and rebirth. In the Old Testament, olive trees grow in the Garden of Eden, as well as the promised land of Canaan. In the New Testament, Christ's agony and consolation from an angel was set in the Garden of Olives. Like the cypress tree that's represented in the Starry Night, the olive tree is evergreen. It's an indelible symbol of rebirth, infinity, eternity. And more specifically, it held a special place within the imagery of early Christian artwork that was produced in Provence, iconography that Van Gogh likely knew from his visit to the Musée Lapidaire in Arles. So during his time in Arles, we know he went to this museum. It was home to a renowned collection of antique Christian sarcophagi that feature putti picking olives from trees, a substitution for the more traditional iconography of the grape harvest. A hybrid pagan Christian motif, the grape harvest symbolized the harvest of life, Christ's blood, and the sacrament of the Eucharist, and eternal life in paradise. And these associations extended to the olive trees in these early Christian Provençal images. You're seeing a postcard there of one of these sarcophagi, dates to the late 19th, early 20th century, and the little red arrow is helping you recognize that as an olive tree, and you can see they're putting olives in their baskets. Thus, while the Garden of Olives is the site of Christ's pain and suffering, the olive tree itself is a symbol of his death, resurrection, and immortality. Drawing upon this complex symbolism, Van Gogh abstracted color and line to evoke the olive tree's comforting, eternal quality and the spiritual renewal that he felt in their presence. By arranging color, by enlarging, by simplifying, he evoked nature's joyous, perpetually renewing life force. Long, rhythmic lines pulsed through his olive trees in the landscape, causing forms to swell and to sway and connecting earth with sky. It's the same throbbing life force that animates the cypresses and the night sky in its pendant, the Starry Night. And just as Van Gogh painted two versions of Christ in the Garden of Olives that he subsequently destroyed, as I mentioned, one was a daytime scene. It was actually set against blue and green hills. The other was set against the night sky. The olive trees and the Starry Night are two sides of the same coin, day and night, life and death, Eden and paradise. As pendants, they offer complementary messages of hope and consolation through the promise of eternity in the great beyond. This, he believed, was the future of modern art, paintings that offer the spiritual consolation once supplied by traditional religious paintings to help us, the modern viewer, endure life's pain and sorrow. Satisfied with his initial synthetist attempt to create a symbolic portrayal of the spiritual resonance and mood of the olive groves, Van Gogh continued his exploration of the Samhami landscape, redoing the olive trees from nature in this picture, which dates to early July, and his constant quest again, really to seize their essential form, and in doing so, he believed he could really seize their inherent meaning. Here in this painting, he emphasizes the tall, graceful forms and flame-like foliage of mature olive trees, using pulsing, impressionistic brushstrokes that radiate light and heat. It's the only painting in the series that Van Gogh signed. He didn't sign many of his pictures in general, I think only about 13 or so from his time in Samhami, but this is the only one in the Olive Grove series. We don't really know what that means. Van Gogh didn't really have a pattern when he signed things. It didn't mean that he sold it. It didn't mean that he exhibited it. So we think perhaps he thought ultimately that it was a milestone in his production, that maybe at that point he thought it best captured the look or the spirit of his subject. But just as he was hitting his stride, Van Gogh was blindsided in mid-July, not long after he made this picture, by the return of his mental illness and an acute attack that left him completely incapacitated for 6 weeks. He didn't begin to recover until late August, and he isolated himself in the asylum. He was weak, he was depressed, and he was suddenly having to face the reality that it wasn't just a fluke, this breakdown he had in Arles, that perhaps this was something that was going to define his health and his life moving forward. And he was afraid to go back outside. So he stayed inside the asylum, and he went to his studio, and he consoled himself by painting copies after his own paintings, as well as prints by other artists, including artists like Eugène Delacroix's Pietà, and you're seeing here Van Gogh's version of that. In his copy, The sorrowful Virgin Mary embraces a dead Christ bearing Van Gogh's own facial features and distinctive red hair and beard, undoubtedly an expression of his longing to be comforted by both human and divine love. For though Van Gogh had expressed his terror and revulsion of the religious thoughts and visions that manifested during his periods of great illness, he found himself turning to Christianity for comfort in times of great distress. This tension between disavowing his need for religion while looking to it for consolation formed the backdrop of his recovery and return to painting that fall. Van Gogh finally returned outdoors to paint in late September, capturing the new effects of fall in this new region that he didn't actually know all that well. So again, he goes back making a few plein air studies. These are small and scale pictures that he's painting in September and then in October. And you can see him starting to kind of figure out how to paint the new colors as, again, we're in a different season now. So he picks up more ochre tones, more bronzes, and just kind of feeling out and experimenting with different ways of capturing the composition. During this time, he looks back at his summer production. All the paintings had dried. They were there in his studio. And he recognized that the synthetist style of the olive trees that you saw just a moment ago and its pendant, the Starry Night, was among the most promising of his recent work. Indeed, he felt that the olive trees must actually be more accentuated, his words, must get more character, so that it's not something vaguely true, but the true soil of Provence, and so it naturally becomes a little abstract. But this resolve to continue in that synthetist vein instantly vanished when he learned what Bernard and Gauguin had been doing that summer. So 6 weeks, no letters, he's hearing nothing, taking a long time to recover, obviously far away, isolated. So he's pretty excited about what he'd done. When between November 10th and November 26th, he got letters from both of these friends bearing descriptions and reproductions of their recent attempts to paint Christ with the angel in the Garden of Olives. He got a watercolor sketch from Gauguin that you're seeing there on the left, and he got a photograph from Bernard of the painting there that you're seeing there on the right. And they didn't just send reproductions, they detailed in their letters really about the style and also the colors that they chose to illustrate, because all of them believed in the symbolic potential of color to say something beyond what's actually being depicted. Van Gogh was irate, and he wrote scathing letters to both of the artists, and also to his brother. You know, it wasn't enough to tell his friends what they were doing wrong, but he also then vented in a series of letters to his brother, and he completely denounced their literal approach to the subject. He centered his criticism on the fact that Gauguin and Bernard had strayed way too far from reality, producing paintings entirely from the imagination in which nothing was observed. For Van Gogh, it was impossible to convey the symbolic resonance of a subject without having seriously studied it from life, as he was doing. And Bernard, he scoffed, had never even seen an olive grove. He scolded Bernard, reminding him that, this is a quote, "In order to give an impression of anxiety, you can try to do it without heading straight for the historical Garden of Gethsemane. In order to offer a consoling and gentle subject, it isn't necessary to depict the figures from the Sermon on the Mount." Nevertheless, the anger and bitterness of his response to their work suggests that there was more at stake than purely aesthetic concerns. I'm showing you here now the actual painting that Gauguin made that you saw illustrated there in that letter. Both Gauguin and Bernard were aware of Van Gogh's abandoned attempts to portray Christ in the Garden of Olives, so they undoubtedly got the idea to paint the subject from him. But what's worse, Gauguin painted Christ with red hair and beard. This is not traditional iconography to depict Christ in the Western tradition. This was a deliberate evocation of Van Gogh, who was actually alone and suffering among the olive groves of Saint-Remy. Adding insult to injury, Gauguin gave his red-headed Christ his own facial features, conflating Van Gogh's appearance and very real pain and isolation with Gauguin's own self-fashioned image as the suffering and misunderstood artist. I mean, come on, could you imagine getting this letter from your friend? In his painting of Christ in the Garden of Olives, Bernard, and we know this from his letter, he also gave his protagonist red hair and beard. So they both created Christ that bore Van Gogh's distinctive coloring. Unfortunately for us, that painting is missing today, and even the original photograph, the location's unknown, but we are lucky that we have this reproduction to show us this missing painting and what Van Gogh received. Bernard takes it a step further, though. In order to underscore the metaphor of Van Gogh in agony among the olive groves, he painted Gauguin as Judas in his original version, and you're seeing him there, his head peeking out between the soldiers in the upper right of the image. And this was likely an allusion to Gauguin's betrayal and desertion of Van Gogh following his self-mutilation in Arles. So basically, this event with the ear happened in front of, well, not quite in front of Gauguin, but somewhat provoked by a heated argument, came home to find Van Gogh very sick and having severed most of his ear. And he left immediately the next morning, so completely abandoned him. I mean, it's just crazy to think that these really were, in theory, friends, and this is how they're communicating feelings to each other through these pictures. It was a combination of his proprietary feelings over the olive groves, as well as his friends' disturbing personalizations of the motif, that prompted Van Gogh's complete about-face regarding the potential of imaginative abstraction. On November 26, less than 2 weeks after he'd first learned of their Christ in the Garden of Olives, he announced to his brother the creation of 5 large olive groves painted directly before the motif that mark a concerted return to the subject and a deliberate distancing from the exaggerated forms that he thought he really wanted to go take even further, if you will. He now saw the abstractions that he put in the Starry Night and its pendant, the olive trees, as, in his words, a dangerous setback. As a counter to the abstracted aesthetic developed by Bernard and Gauguin, Van Gogh re-immersed himself in nature. The thing is, they'd driven me mad with their Christ in the garden, in which nothing is observed, he wrote to Theo. Well, to shake this off, I've been messing about in the groves morning and evening on these bright and cold days. Begun in late November and executed over the course of a few weeks, Van Gogh's new paintings that you're seeing here on the screen are distinguished from his earlier olive groves by their remarkably unified compositional structure and aesthetic. In order to capture the mood of the groves at dawn and at dusk, he relied on the techniques of Impressionism and Neo-Impressionism, aesthetics founded on the rigorous transcription of the optical sensation of light and atmosphere. What I've done is a rather harsh and coarse realism beside their abstractions, he wrote to Theo, but it will nevertheless impart the rustic note and will smell of the soil. Probably the first of the 5 November paintings, Olive Trees, that I'm showing you here, is unique for its inclusion of the sun, which blankets the morning sky in a vivid yellow. In fact, again, one of Van Gogh's destroyed sketches of Christ in the Garden of Olives also happened to feature a yellow sky with violet hills. A traditional emblem of the divine, the sun often appears in Van Gogh's spiritually symbolic paintings as allusions to God or to Christ. Connected to the theme of the resurrection, its rising presence in olive trees demonstrates Van Gogh's ideas on how to create a consoling and gentle subject that evokes religious sentiments without depicting biblical figures. And despite Van Gogh's renewed commitment to working directly from nature, if you take a look at the trees' cast shadows, you'll notice that they don't align with the position of the sun. So imagination and synthesis still played a role in Van Gogh's approach. The bold palette and expressive brushwork of the painting we just looked at would give way in the other 4 olive groves from late November. Van Gogh deliberately shifted his style as well as his application of paint, using less impastos, which is sort of a thick application of paint that, in fact, we celebrate him for today. He applied color in the foreground in thin washes, and he applied harmonious colors in orderly brushstrokes that I think are really evident in these 2 examples. Van Gogh particularly admired Claude Monet, and we're seeing his influence here. Monet, around 1886, had begun to make series of landscapes that singled out motifs from different regions around France. Van Gogh had actually visited Monet's 1887 exhibition at Georges Petit's gallery in Paris when he was living there, and that show included 8 paintings executed in the coastal village of Belle-Île. Featuring a limited range of motifs and an equally limited range of compositions, these views of an ensemble, as one of the critics called them, enjoyed significant critical and financial success. So less than a year after that, in 1888, Van Gogh's brother Theo organized his own solo show of Monet's serial paintings at the gallery where he worked in Paris, Busseau et Valadon. This was another critical and commercial smash for Monet, who showed a handful of views painted in Antibes, also in southern France, that he'd done over the course of 4 months in varying conditions of light and atmosphere. Vincent, who by that time was living in Arles, discussed Theo's shows enthusiastically in his correspondence with his brother. And these will come into play again, strangely enough, during his long convalescence in Saint-Remy, which took place, as you heard, from August to December of 1889. During that time, Van Gogh read Octave Mirbeau's essay on Monet, which appeared in the catalog that his brother had sent him of the recent exhibition Monet-Rodin that was taking place in Paris. So he was incredibly well read, and even though he was physically isolated, he was very connected with what was going on in the avant-garde circles up north and in Paris. Mirbeau, who wrote this essay, praised Monet's revolutionary paintings, declaring them to be the product of the artist's, quote, moral isolation, self-focus, and immersion in nature. Sound familiar? Rebutting the common critique that the Impressionists could only transcribe rather than analyze their subjects, Mirbeau stressed Monet's methodical, rational plan, these are his words, that he described as being in some ways mathematical, sort of casting Monet's process as scientific, like that of Seurat. Van Gogh's adoption of Impressionist and Neo-Impressionist or Pointillist techniques in November of 1889 were strongly informed by Monet's serial paintings and the critical discourse that surrounded them. They probably seemed to affirm to him that although he had stylistically strayed when he flirted with synthetism on those few occasions, by re-immersing himself in nature and returning to a more realistic style, that he was back on the right path to artistic success, but sort of poignantly also to better health. As he wrote to his brother, by adopting a more scientific, orderly style, he sought to fend off both abstraction as well as his mental illness. So he really sadly connected the two, and he thought this is going to be the healthiest way and the most productive way for me to move forward. And it's really just extraordinary, again, when you look at those paintings. The one on the right, if you look at the sky, is complete and total pointillism. Although Van Gogh insisted that he turned his back on abstracting or inventing from nature, his November Olive Grove painting still continued his quest to impart the peace, abundance, serenity, and spiritual consolation that he associated with the olive tree. Reinforcing its symbolism as the tree of life is the presence of ripening olives in the painting that you're seeing there on the left, and they can be a little hard to make out, but they're these little kind of dabs that you see on the edges of the branches. A sign of the changing seasons, the presence of olives also provided Van Gogh with the opportunity to depict the harvest, one of his favorite motifs that alludes to God's reaping of humanity and the eternal cycle of life and death. As he explained to his brother about mid-November, "If I remain here, I wouldn't try to paint a Christ in the Garden of Olives, but in fact the olive picking as it's still seen today, and then giving the correct proportions of the human figure in it that would perhaps make people think of it all the same." Van Gogh reprised the landscape of the orange and green sunset sky there on the left in a variant that he described, a variant with figures that portrays a man and a woman plucking olives from within the grove. This painting had extensive fading. We're not going to talk about that tonight. Extensive red fading, so it can be a little hard to make out the figures, but here's the woman, and there's the man there in the background. They're portrayed within the olive grove at dusk, their arms raised to pick fruit from the trees. And in many ways, this couple seems to evoke Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, symbols of fertility and life, as well as allusions to humankind's fall, and also ultimately its salvation through Christ's death and resurrection. By setting the autumnal scene during daylight's waning hours, Van Gogh drew upon traditional allegories of the stages of human life, in this case, humankind's twilight. But once again, the prospect of inevitable death isn't sad or frightening, but for Van Gogh, it was rather sweet and serene through the promise of eternity in the afterlife. Of all the olive grove paintings, Van Gogh considered the depiction of 3 women picking olives to be his best. And he started by making one, at least to become this picture, outdoors in front of the motif in November, and then would go on to make 2 repetitions of it, same size, but you can see not quite the same, later in December. Through a process of refinement, he would continue to hone both the sort of arrangement, if you will, of the central trio of figures to distill the subject's meaning, as well as to hone the complementary color scheme. So you see it kind of begins with something that's a little bit more naturalistic, but in the final version, there on the right, he's reduced the composition basically to two sets of contrasting complementary colors, red, or pink and green, and yellow and purple. Again, he does this in order to convey the symbolism and the emotional charge of the scene. He explained to his brother that he'd wanted to evoke something of a memory softened by time. On the one hand, the three women are evocative of the three muses from classical antiquity, and for many, this kind of represents a kind of pastoral idyll. But there's an interesting detail that he repeated in all three versions that might point to another meaning that Van Gogh intended to express in the composition. Although he had observed women picking olives in the groves, he still relied upon his imagination to construct the vignette of the three women. And we know this because he took certain liberties, whether by accident or, in my view, maybe intentional. Orchard ladders, like the one that you see depicted, only have rungs for climbing on one side, and they're stabilized by a simple pole without footholds on the other. So if you look at this postcard, you see this is the side that you can climb, and this is like a tripod. This is the pole that you cannot climb. It doesn't have a foothold. It just stabilizes the ladder. But if you look at Van Gogh's paintings, and this is the case, and he repeats it in all three versions, the central figure, dressed in blue, with kind of a strange white head covering, well, she's standing in a completely untenable position. She's floating somewhere between earth and sky. Van Gogh intentionally repeated this detail as he actively refined this figural group from painting to painting, and their interrelated gestures, again in the two subsequent repetitions. Pressed close to each other around the wooden ladder, their outstretched arms ready to receive and deposit olives. The trio's triangular formation and elegantly choreographed poses recall traditional deposition scenes in which Christ's body is lowered from the cross, often in the presence of the three Marys, Mary Magdalene, Mary Salome, and the Virgin Mary, whose iconography is a blue cloak and covered head. The three Marys both witnessed the crucifixion and discovered Christ's empty tomb the following morning, and are thus standard iconography for the depiction of the resurrection. By giving the sky and his three versions of women picking olives the rosy glow of dawn, Van Gogh may have deliberately been using color to evoke Christ's ascension to heaven, while also giving the image the dreamlike quality that he sought. Another example of consolatory painting, women picking olives conveys the comfort provided by the promise of eternal life after death. After toiling in the groves for a few weeks, Van Gogh wrote to his brother, again late November 1889, that the result is 5 number 30 canvases, that's a size, they're all the same size. The result is 5 number 30 canvases, which, with the 3 studies of olive trees that you have, he's describing those 3 from the summer that he'd sent there at the top. So altogether, you at least have an attack on the problem. So he saw them all together, these 8, as really showing a response, if you will, to the challenge that Bernard and Gauguin had thrown down. In their scale, scope, aesthetic aims, and symbolism, the Olive Grove series is one of the most ambitious and significant that Van Gogh produced in what was ultimately a really short career. It only spanned 10 years. They are a tribute to his incredible talent and vision for what modern art should strive to be and the role that it could play within a modern society. Van Gogh finally achieved what he admired so much in the work of artists like Millet. However, unlike the sowers and reapers that Millet had inspired, the olive trees were Van Gogh's and his alone. Van Gogh seemed to sense the weight of this extraordinary accomplishment and the potential of incorporating additional paintings to the Olive Grove series to garner him critical and financial success. I still have the great desire to do for the mountains and for the cypresses what I've just done for the olive trees, have a really good go at them, he wrote to Theo. The thing is, the olive tree and the cypress have rarely been painted. I think that this must be the center of the work I've done here and there in Provence, and then we can conclude the stay here when it's convenient. Van Gogh had actually begun to consider leaving Saint-Remy and returning north following his breakdown in July when he was recovering that fall. He believed that the asylum, which was housed in a medieval monastery administered by nuns, provoked the terrifying religious hallucinations that he experienced during his crisis. As he slowly regained his health, however, he became eager to expand upon his Olive Grove series, and he identified, as you've just heard, these additional motifs that express the timeless character of the region, such as cypress trees and the alpeel. When I'm back north, he wrote to Theo, at best it will form a kind of ensemble, impressions of Provence. By referring to his series of characteristic regional motifs as impressions, and implying his intent to exhibit them as an ensemble upon his return to the north, Van Gogh aligned himself with Monet. The 5 Impressionist and Neo-Impressionist paintings that he executed in November, which capture, as you've seen, the fleeting effects of light and atmosphere in the olive groves from similar viewpoints at different times of day, were surely deliberate attempts to achieve similar success. With this in mind, he prolonged his stay at the asylum in order to attack this problem and to attack the cypresses and also the mountains. And I'm showing you here a wheat field with cypresses, which is one of only a handful of paintings that features all 3 of what became his favorite Provençal motifs, the cypresses, the alpeels, and the olive trees. I think I'm probably the only one in history who was so excited to recognize the scrubby little olive tree in the face of this majestic cypress, and of course the alpeels in the background. Symbols of death and immortality in the Mediterranean, cypress trees had captivated Van Gogh since his arrival in Saint-Remy, and he made a few initial studies that June, but interrupted by his illness in July, he wouldn't resume the motif until that fall. So this painting was done in September after a work that he'd started in June. So it's one of the copies that he made after his own works when he was recovering indoors in the asylum that September. The Alpine Mountains took a little longer to grow on him, and at first it formed a backdrop to a much more familiar theme, such as the sower, and you're seeing that there, wheat field. Well, here we have a reaper, not a sower. He's a little bit invisible in this beautiful golden landscape. Began in June, and then finished in September, so his work on it was interrupted by this illness, so he picks it back up and again in fall, and you'll see that it has this beautiful yellow sky, and he describes it again to his brother in a letter. I then saw in this reaper the image of death in the sense that humanity would be the wheat being reaped. But in this death, nothing sad. It takes place in broad daylight with a sun that floods everything with a light of fine gold. It's all yellow except for a line of violet hills, a pale blonde yellow. So while the alpeels initially served as a color note, if you will, there in the painting on the left, sort of accentuating the drama that's unfolding in the wheat field in the foreground, the alpeel eventually would come to capture his imagination in their own right. He sort of deemed them as worthy of a standalone subject, and even talked about the fact that it took a long time for him to really see the beauty in this subject. And you can see there in the beautiful painting on the right that he's again sort of relying on the symbolic language of color, pairing the contrasting complementaries of yellow and sort of a violet shade for the mountains to give a kind of celestial quality over this ancient and evocative subject. But despite his strong desire to remain in Saint-Remy until his series of alpeel and cypresses was complete, things sadly would turn out differently. In December of 1889, Van Gogh suffered another of what became significant, reoccurring breakdowns that left him weak and despondent. Convinced that the asylum was exacerbating his illness, he left for Auvers-sur-Oise, a small village just north of Paris, on May 13th of 1890, having only completed the Olive Grove series. Before leaving, however, he made one final painting that summarized all of his ideas, all of his hopes and dreams for his series, Impressions of Provence. In a walk at twilight that you're seeing here on the screen, Van Gogh painted himself strolling with a woman through the olive groves at dusk, the scene set against the backdrop of the alpeel, framed on either side by the rising forms of cypresses. A farewell to this region that he'd grown to deeply cherish, the painting evoked for the last time the feelings of peace, eternity, and solace that he associated with this imagery of paradise on earth. Painted in the final weeks at the asylum, it reflected his own need for spiritual consolation as he struggled to accept his increasingly troubled fate with courage, strength, and optimism. Thank you. Well, we have time for questions, and I know that there's a microphone that will circulate. Here we have our wonderful colleague. So if you have a question, make yourself known, and I would ask you, if you could, to wait until you get the microphone so that everyone in the room can hear the question.
Thank you, Lulan. Oh, thank you so much. It was really, so touching and fabulous to see all this series. And I was wondering, can you tell a bit about what happens to those paintings exactly, like after he dies? Like, what's the provenance? What happens to them?
That's a great question. So basically, he would send his brother Theo consignment. So he would send these shipments up to Paris in different intervals. So all the olive trees make their way to his brother Theo in Paris. And Theo will end up dying 6 months after Vincent does. And so it's Theo's young widow, a woman named Joanna, her maiden name was Bonger, Van Gogh. She inherits all of Van Gogh's work. I mean, he's sold, we think, one painting in his lifetime. And from there, she really became sort of the woman behind the man, if you will, who made it her life's mission to get these paintings seen, to exhibit them, and to try to place them in a lot of different collections. It would take way too long, I think, to go through the 15 paintings in terms of provenance, but they did all, for the most part, find themselves in public, important institutions and collections. So there are paintings that you've seen that are at the Met, at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., in Minneapolis here in the States, in Kansas City, and then in Europe, primarily, you find them sort of in Amsterdam and Otterlo at the Kröller-Müller Museum, Scotland. There are 2 that are in private foundations, one in Switzerland, one in Athens. So it was really astounding to me, in fact, that nobody had done this project before, because it's not as if they're hidden away. You would think that would be the obvious answer, that nobody knew these existed and there really was an opportunity to kind of fall in love with them or to have this kind of inquiry. But no, and many of them found their ways into these collections really early. So at the Nelson Atkins, for example, they bought their painting in 1932. Which, I mean, Van Gogh hadn't actually been gone for so long that he wasn't considered to be a contemporary artist of sorts. It's kind of extraordinary. But yeah, they each kind of have their own twists and turns, but 3 of the 15 paintings are at the Van Gogh Museum. Those stayed with the family. And 2 of them ended up in the Kröller-Müller collection in Otterlo, which is just outside of Amsterdam, which was a museum founded by a couple's private collection. So I suspect that maybe they were, acquired directly from the family at some point as well. Yes, I see a question, 5th or 6th row.
Did he sell well during this contemporary time of his, sending at the gallery only with his brother?
Not at all. He sold, we think, 1 painting, and it was purchased by an artist herself who had an appreciation, a Belgian female painter. There was no audience, there was no market, really, for art like this. So in Van Gogh's time, Impressionism was just starting to become a bit more mainstream, but it was still tough even for his brother, who was a dealer in Paris, to even give an exhibition, a dedicated show for Monet, for example. So in this grand gallery they had on the ground floor, the more important street-level gallery, sort of established, more mainstream artists. And so for the show for Monet, it was upstairs in the attic. But that was even a big coup that this young dealer could even have a show like that. He had to convince the owners of the gallery that it was worth the risk. So Van Gogh's paintings, when they were exhibited, really, really shocked the critics. I mean, he did exhibit in his lifetime, not too many things, but he did manage actually to exhibit one of these olive groves, and nobody knew what to do with them. The colors were a lot more vibrant at the time as well. Many of them suffer from pigment fading, and they just couldn't figure out what this was. And I mean, the great tragedy, and he's not the only artist to die young and then find that his artwork almost immediately had an audience and a market. Within 10 years after his death in 1890, there were exhibitions in Paris, a lot of exhibitions being held in locations in Germany, and we're starting to sell exponentially. So it's heartbreaking, because he really was a starving artist in all true sense of the word, and was misunderstood and misappreciated, and was just starting to get some critical recognition among members of the avant-garde when he died.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank
It's
you.
slightly off the subject, but it's always been amazing to me when I first learned about it. Are there any other examples in the art world of the contemporaneous letters from Vincent to Theo that explain what he was thinking? And
Oh, you mean
are
letters
there
from
any
Vincent?
other examples in the art world of artists and
Other artists.
letters explaining what they were thinking at the time?
Oh, yeah. I mean, what's really interesting is that there are theories out there that Van Gogh wrote as much about his art and wrote as eloquently as he did about his art because of the fact that artist letters were starting to be published. So he got to read Delacroix's letters, a substantial amount of them that had been published in his lifetime, for example. And so there are a lot of ideas that when these types of either memoirs by artists or publishing their letters, that maybe that's why he spoke as much. I don't know that I really believe that. He didn't have as much faith, sadly, in his own ability as all of that. I mean, he lived by himself. There's no radio, there's no phone, there's no TV, and every night he would go home and just kind of talk about his day, with his brother. There are letters from Van Gogh that exist too as well, to Bernard, to Gauguin. So, and sometimes we're lucky enough to have the letters, as you saw, that Gauguin sent to him. So it's he wasn't unique in that way. But I will say that he's an extraordinary writer. All of the letters have actually been not just transcribed, but translated into English and are available on, for free on the internet. And it's a site called vangoghletters.org that's administered by the Van Gogh Museum. It's an extraordinary resource. If you're curious, go and read them. It's striking, even still to me now, he was so smart. I mean, he was incredibly well educated. He had 2 other careers before he became an artist. So he tried his hand at being a dealer. Family thought he's not well suited to that. Then he went into the family's other line of business, was just to become a minister. They kicked him out. He was overzealous. And then he became an artist at the suggestion of Theo, his brother, because he'd always, kind of had a love for doing that. So he was really well read, but he had almost a photographic memory for images that he'd seen years before. I mean, he'll write about them in Saint Remy, prints that he probably saw 15 years earlier with pretty accurate descriptions where we know what he's talking about today. Same with books and literature. So he's astounding. And it's amazing. So he's Dutch. He writes to his brother Theo exclusively in French. But he also spoke English. He could write English too, so he wrote some letters in English to, painter friends that were native English speakers. So they're a treat to read. Not all artists, I think, leave letters and a legacy like that.
I've always been really interested in his vision.
In what? I'm sorry.
His vision.
His vision.
Yeah. It seems to me that he's portraying the kind of disintegration of the sort of static way we all view our realities, and into a transformation or a movement or a change of the world, the way he sees it, the way he visualizes it. And the movement in that painting is a continuation to me of that vision, a continuation of that transformation that may be due to his obviously due to his mental state. But is there anything, did he write about that at all? Did he express that in any of his?
I'm not sure if I fully understand your question, but one thing that I will say is I don't believe that his paintings, his style, look the way they do because of his mental illness. In fact, he's a brilliant painter in spite of this incredible, debilitating disease that he was afflicted with. As I mentioned, he was not able to paint. He couldn't even write letters when he was ill. And of course, his art is influenced by that experience. And I think for me, what was so interesting about learning about the olive groves, of which there was very little written, was this backdrop of suffering and trying to find hope in nature through the scene around him, the landscape, and sort of drawing that out, in different ways. I think it was a triumph in the face of great distress and, again, uncertainty and very painful disease.
I didn't mean to imply a negative with that. Actually, it was very.
Well,
I thought very positive. I thought very positively
Yeah.
about it because, I think he's seeing the world in a very different way than we see it.
I'll agree with you there.
Oh,
Yeah.
Thank you. And to me, there's a transformation of the way we view things. and a movement in his paintings that continues that transformation. They're so full of life and so vivid.
I love it. As you can see, there are so many different ways to look at Van Gogh's paintings, and the fact that we still see different things when we look at them. I think that we're all still so moved by the paintings. And for him, I want to say this is one interpretation of the olive groves. Of course, there's many others to be made. With Van Gogh, it's never simple either when it comes to the symbolism. As I mentioned, he's so educated and he's drawing on all these different visual traditions, literary traditions, that there's a lot of layering, and they're very complex. And I'll leave this as the sort of parting thought. One thing that also fascinates me, and will probably fascinate you in your question about vision and style, is that he called himself a realist. He saw himself as a realist painter, maybe an impressionist. And I think that's just for us today to look at this is really surprising to see how he even categorized his own work versus, when we look at the history of art and we think about realism and then the schools that come after impressionism, neo-impressionism, that it meant something very different to him, I think. But anyway, I thank you all again for coming tonight and for these excellent questions. Thank you so much.